The air raid sirens began their unnerving, rising lament at precisely 1,720 hours on September 7th, 1940, signaling the official start of the London Blitz. This early evening raid over the East End confirmed the strategic shift. The German Luftwaffe, having failed to break the Royal Air Force, had turned its destructive focus from military airfields to Britain's civilian populations. Mary Thompson, engaged in the mundane ritual of hanging washing in the small yard behind her terrace house in Stephen, instantly recognized the eerie mechanical howl that had become the defining voice of that autumn. Her immediate, primal concern was for her daughters, 8-year-old Beatrice and 5-year-old Margaret, who were playing innocently in the front street with neighborhood children. They had perhaps only minutes before the devastating formations arrived. With the practice, deliberate composure standardized among London mothers determined not to transmit panic, she called them inside. "Come along, darlings. Shelter time. Bring your dolls." The destination was the Anderson shelter at the garden's end, a corrugated steel structure, half buried in the damp earth, designed specifically to withstand the near misses of high explosive ordnance. Mary had transformed the cramped space into a functional sanctuary. Blankets, a small oil lamp, a tin of emergency biscuits, books for the girls, and her knitting. The well-rehearsed routine unfolded swiftly. Shoes on, coats grabbed, precious dolls and books collected. They descended the garden path, pulled the heavy door shut, and waited. As the sun set, the attack materialized. Over 300 Luftwaffe aircraft arrived in a devastating formation, their combined engines creating a sustained mechanical thunder that caused the very ground beneath the shelter to vibrate. Mary sat, her daughters pressed tightly against her sides, listening to the terrifying whistle of descending bombs, followed by the deep, resonant crump of explosions that began in the distance and steadily walked nearer, like the colossal footsteps of approaching giants. The first bomb that impacted close enough to truly matter struck. The detonation, perhaps only 2 streets distant, manifested as a profound physical force. The air compressed violently, causing ears to pop, while the subterranean shelter convulsed under the impact. Dirt and pulverized debris rained down from the corrugated iron ceiling. While Beatrice whimpered and Margaret clutched her doll tightly, Mary initiated a response of measured defiance. She began singing softly, steadily, the familiar melody of an old music hall standard, a sentimental song about summer by the seaside. After a brief hesitation, the girls joined her. Their collective voices, though thin and reedy, offer a fragile counterpoint to the relentless thunder of the aerial bombardment. The raid persisted for hours. The grim symphony of the Blitz unfolded. Concussive explosions, the roar of spreading fire, the high-pitched shriek of aircraft engines, the sharp crack of defensive anti-aircraft artillery, and the ominous whistle of incoming incendiary devices. Throughout this ordeal, Mary sang with her daughters, knitted meticulously by the dim lamplight, when they finally succumbed to sleep, maintaining the resolute calm that had become the required psychological posture for British civilians under sustained attack. Fear was acknowledged, terror recognized, but neither was permitted to dominate the imperative of survival. This was a deliberate choice to carry on, because carrying on was deemed the essential civic duty. When the siren issued the long, conclusive note of the all-clear at dawn, Mary emerged to survey her street, which had been catastrophically transformed. Just 3 houses down the road stood reduced to smoking, pulverized rubble. The corner shop, where she purchased daily milk, had been gutted, its entire front wall peeled away. Fire still consumed structures in the distance, sending thick columns of smoke across the nascent sunrise. Yet her own dwelling stood intact. Though the windows were blown out and roof tiles were scattered like shrapnel, the structure remained fundamentally sound. She immediately initiated the rituals of domestic resilience, making tea, tuning the wireless for news bulletins. The girls were washed and dressed. They ate breakfast, tinned sardines on toast, utilizing the last remaining bread, while listening to the measured tones of the BBC announcer calmly detailing the devastation of the previous night's raids. Mary then walked her daughters toward the school gates, navigating carefully around mounds of debris and shattered glass, nodding to neighbors engaged in the identical task. All of them maintained a collective, necessary fiction that this was merely the standard morning routine, not the immediate aftermath of an apocalyptic assault. At the school gates, The headmistress stood awaiting them. Despite the faint tremor of fear, the schoolmarm, Mrs. Thompson, maintained her rigid bearing while checking off children's names. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson. Good morning, girls. Classes begin at 9 o'clock, as usual." This routine was the bedrock of defiance. Mary, having returned home only to sweep shrapnel and glass from her floors, covered her blown-out windows with makeshift cardboard and tape before rushing to the munitions factory. The morning shift began precisely at 8 o'clock, and though she was 3 minutes late, the bus route diverted due to fresh bomb damage, she joined every other woman on her shift. They were exhausted, frightened, yet resolutely present, committed to the work deemed essential for survival. This grueling morning marked the immediate aftermath of the first night of what would escalate into 57 consecutive nights of aerial bombardment. The Blitz had officially begun, and London was now the crucible where German expectations were tested. The Luftwaffe's strategy for breaking Britain was rooted in an articulated doctrine of psychological warfare, successfully employed in Poland and France. This straightforward approach mandated the systematic bombing of civilian centers, designed specifically to shatter morale, induce population panic, and generate irresistible political pressure, compelling government surrender. The theoretical framework was sound. Sustained aerial bombardment reliably produced terror among civilian populations, leading to psychological collapse, mass flight, and the definitive breakdown of civil order. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, expressed supreme confidence in this outcome. "The Führer has ordered me to destroy London," Göring boasted. "I shall reduce it to ashes. The British will beg for terms within weeks." This operational plan reflected his certainty. Commencing September 7th, hundreds of bombers were scheduled to strike London nightly. Targets were comprehensive: docks, vital factories, transportation hubs, and, crucially, residential areas. High explosive bombs were designated to obliterate structures, while incendiaries were intended to ignite uncontrollable infernos. The sustained campaign aimed to create a cascading psychological effect: sleeplessness, crippling fear, and the irreversible loss of homes. German intelligence assessments confidently predicted that sustained aerial bombardment would shatter British morale within 2 to 3 weeks, leading inevitably to political surrender and the disruption of essential services. This expectation was firmly rooted in historical precedent. No major European city had previously endured prolonged, intensive aerial bombing without succumbing to population panic and total political dissolution. London, the strategists believed, would prove no exception to this established pattern. The opening salvo, the first night of the Blitz, involved over 300 bombers unleashing hundreds of tons of high explosives and incendiary devices directly onto East London. The resulting conflagration devastated residential areas and set the critical docks ablaze. Casualties were immediate and severe, exceeding 400 killed and wounding over 300 in that single terrifying night, a level of destruction that surpassed anything the capital had ever witnessed. Returning German pilots reported massive fires visible even from the French coast, confirming the tactical success of the raids. They merely awaited the psychological collapse that historically followed. Yet, the anticipated breaking point never arrived. The morning after the first major raid, London delivered a response the German High Command had entirely failed to calculate. Resolute continuation. Buses resumed service, carefully diverted around bomb damage. Underground trains ran on modified schedules. Workers who had lost their homes overnight still reported dutifully to their factories. Shops that could open did so, even if their windows were shattered. Schools held classes in surviving buildings, merging students whose schools had been destroyed. This was not merely heroic defiance. It was a profound, practical stubbornness. Work needed doing. Children required education, and life, in its most essential form, demanded continuation. Londoners endured this existential threat with the same calm determination they reserved for any other unavoidable inconvenience, a testament to the preparations Winston Churchill's government had initiated through civil defense organizations established during the lead-up to the conflict. The meticulous planning of the pre-war years was immediately activated. Air raid wardens efficiently directed citizens toward designated shelters, while fire brigades engaged Inferno with systematic efficiency. Rescue teams labored tirelessly, extracting survivors from the shattered rubble, and medical services established casualty clearing stations. The comprehensive machinery of civil defense, though never flawless, functioned adequately, succeeding in maintaining essential civic order amidst circumstances engineered to induce widespread panic. Crucially, the underground railway system transformed into an extensive network of mass shelters. Nightly, upwards of 100,000 people descended to platforms, forging improvised subterranean communities within the tunnels. The government had initially opposed the use of these stations, citing legitimate concerns regarding sanitation, psychological dependency, and the logistical challenge of ensuring evacuation post-raid. However, the overwhelming force of public demand and practical necessity ultimately prevailed, cementing the tube's role as London's essential bedroom throughout the duration of the Blitz. The resulting scenes below ground would have profoundly contradicted the expectations of German military planners who anticipated widespread public hysteria. Families established regular, designated sleeping spots, bringing personal effects, bedding, books, knitting, and playing cards. Children completed their homework under the glow of portable lamplight, while adults maintained crucial social routines, singing popular songs and exchanging jokes, displaying remarkable fortitude in the most abnormal and pressurized environments. The famed British capacity for queuing, forming orderly, disciplined lines, extended seamlessly to shelter access. Citizens waited patiently for their turn to descend to safety, demonstrating disciplined patience rather than panic or disorder. Mary Thompson and her two daughters joined this nightly migration after the third major raid rendered their house uninhabitable. They would join the queue at Stepney Green Station punctually around 6 o'clock in the evening, descend to the platform, and claim their regular, established position, the third alcove from the stairs on the left side. There, they settled in for the night. Beatrice invariably read, Margaret played quietly with her doll, and Mary diligently knitted socks for the soldiers, all while absorbing the low, continuous murmur surrounding families' conversations. The human response to this existential threat was often characterized by a determined, almost defiant normalcy. Families sought to frame the terror not as catastrophe, but as an unusual endurance test. Mary, attempting to reassure her daughters amidst the subterranean tremor, presented the grim reality with forced optimism. It's not so terrible, she insisted. Rather like camping, isn't it? An adventure underground. The children, trusting the calm authority of their mother, accepted this necessary fiction, even as a distant rumble of explosions vibrated the platform beneath their feet. This enforced subterranean existence became the standard for 57 consecutive nights. The systematic bombing campaign, known as the Blitz, commenced without interruption on September 7th and continued relentlessly through November 2nd, 1940. The population quickly adapted to this predictable, terrifying rhythm. The pattern became a grim routine. Sirens heralded the early evening, triggering the mass migration to deep shelters. Luftwaffe bombers arrived at dusk, initiating hours of punishing bombardment that lasted until pre-dawn, all clear. At first light, the population emerged to assess the devastation. Work crews immediately mobilized to clear debris. Firefighters battled infernos that had raged unchecked, and medical personnel treated the mounting casualties. Yet, the essential daily activities, work, school, shopping, the very act of living, were conducted in the daylight hours, before the cycle of destruction recommenced at dusk. The targets varied, yet the intensity of the assault remained constant. One night might see the destruction of the vital docks, another the city financial district, sometimes the affluent West End, but most frequently the densely populated East End, where working-class families inhabited vulnerable terrace housing. The Luftwaffe employed a brutal two-pronged strategy. High-explosive ordnance was dropped first to demolish buildings and create unstable rubble, followed by waves of incendiaries designed to ignite the wreckage. This calculated combination aimed to overwhelm London's firefighting capacity and catalyze unstoppable firestorms. London was consumed by fire. Night after night, vast swaths of the capital were illuminated by a fierce, orange glow, visible across the English countryside for hundreds of miles. So extensive were the blazes that German bomber crews navigated their return missions using the light cast by previous raids. Pilots reported seeing the city from the French coast, a horrifying red stain on the northern horizon, marking a metropolis subjected to systematic destruction. But the city did not break. The casualty statistics documented the Blitz exacted a devastating human cost. By the close of 1940, the relentless aerial assault had claimed the lives of over 13,000 Londoners, while more than 18,000 had been seriously wounded. Hundreds of thousands of citizens found themselves displaced, their residences annihilated. Entire historic neighborhoods were systematically reduced to ruin. The resulting material damage was staggering in its scope. Private homes, critical factories, irreplaceable historic buildings, and essential infrastructure all suffer extensive destruction. Yet, the profound psychological collapse that German strategists had anticipated failed utterly to materialize. A stubborn, quiet defiance took root. Workers whose residences had been demolished still reported punctually to their factories. Children whose schools lay in rubble attended makeshift classes organized in church halls. Families who had lost nearly everything meticulously maintained their domestic routines, utilizing whatever meager possessions remained. The persistent British refusal to acknowledge defeat was articulated in these small, daily acts of normality maintained against all logical expectation. The quiet courage, the true heroism of the Blitz, proved to be fundamentally domestic, not dramatic. It resided in the fortitude of mothers, such as Mary Thompson, singing reassuringly to their children deep within communal shelters while explosives detonated above ground. It was evident in the laborers emerging from sleepless nights in the underground to operate the machinery of war production, and in the shopkeepers opening their damaged establishments because the community required goods. It was the teachers holding lessons in buildings where the windows had been entirely blown out. Life continued its steady, undramatic rhythm in circumstances specifically designed to render life impossible. The milkman still executed his deliveries. The postman diligently completed his rounds, even when half the addresses on his route were non-existent patches of debris. Bus drivers skillfully navigated congested streets around fresh bomb craters. Policemen directed the flow of traffic through avenues littered with masonry and glass. These were not grand gestures, but rather relentless small insistences that the structure of civilian life would persist despite the extraordinary circumstances. Crucially dry, understated British humor functioned as an essential psychological defense mechanism. A shop whose entire facade had been obliterated displayed a sign declaring, "More open than usual." A public house, having been struck by incendiary bombs, advertised simply, The refusal to acknowledge catastrophe as final defined the British response during sustained aerial onslaught. A bombed-out church could defiantly post a notice, "Services as usual in the crypt," while citizens quipped that the drinks are still on fire. This deliberate decision to meet the apocalyptic bombing of the Blitz with an unwavering resolution, buffered by tea and dark humor, was psychologically devastating to German assumptions. The Luftwaffe could reduce buildings to rubble, but it could not extinguish the spirit that answered destruction with wit. Prime Minister Winston Churchill understood this national instinct profoundly. His wartime broadcasts maintained a calm, resolute tone that acknowledged the difficulty of the situation while expressing absolute confidence in ultimate victory. He personalized this leadership by visiting the bombed areas, walking through the smoking ruins in his signature Homburg hat and bow tie, stop and converse with rescue workers and survivors. His physical presence communicated an immediate, tangible message. The leadership remained present and wholly engaged. This resilience had been articulated before the Blitz even commenced. "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be," he had declared to Parliament. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." This was not mere rhetoric. It was a foundational statement of national intention. Britain would endure. London would endure. The bombs could kill people, destroy homes, and incinerate districts, yet they could not force capitulation, precisely because surrender was simply excluded from the spectrum of options the British were willing to consider. This failure led to profound German confusion. For the Luftwaffe pilots flying nightly missions over the capital, the steadfast British response was incomprehensible. They had been assured that British morale would inevitably collapse. The formula had succeeded elsewhere. Cities bombed into submission, Populations panicked into demanding cessation of conflict, and governments forced to capitulate by their own terrified citizenry. This established military doctrine, applied to London with massive, sustained force over a prolonged period, should have yielded compliance. Instead, night after night, the resistance held firm. High above the inferno, Luftwaffe pilots gazed upon a city that, impossibly, refused to surrender its functions. The anti-aircraft barges were not diminishing. Indeed, London's defenses seemed to be strengthening, the dense flak and undiminished searchlights sweeping the night sky with defiant determination. Even as the embers of previous raids still glowed, new lights appeared in windows, and the relentless hum of traffic continued moving through the streets, demonstrating an operational continuity despite the accumulated devastation. This growing bewilderment was meticulously documented in the diary of man Klaus Fischer, who flew 34 missions over the capital during the Blitz. Reflecting on the sheer, stubborn resilience of the British, Fischer wrote on September 15th, "Another night over London. The city burns but never dies. We drop our bombs, see the fires, know we've hit them hard. Yet, we return the next night, and they're still there, still fighting. Searchlights as bright as ever. How do they maintain this defiance?" This confusion mounted into official disbelief. By October 8th, German intelligence reports confirmed the impossible. British morale remained surprisingly high. "This seems impossible," the reports noted. "We have destroyed entire districts, killed thousands. They should be begging for terms." Instead of panic, radio intercepts revealed normal commercial broadcasts, music programs and comedy shows, running without interruption. By October 23 RD, Fischer spoke for his entire squadron. They were winning tactically, hitting targets and causing massive damage, but strategically, the campaign was failing. London would not break. Britain would not sue for peace. The overall intelligence assessment confirmed this profound strategic puzzle. Civilian morale remained robust despite sustained bombardment. Crucially, war production levels continued near normal rates, and the government functioned without apparent disruption. All key metrics suggested that the psychological objective of the bombing campaign, to induce terror and demand for surrender, was failing utterly. Recognizing that the current level of destruction was insufficient to break the British will, the Luftwaffe command made the only logical, if ultimately futile, response, intensifying the raids further. The relentless aerial assault intensified. The tonnage of high explosives and incendiaries systematically dropped upon the capital increased, yet London, while burning, refused to cease functioning. The true testament to British fortitude emerged in the subterranean architecture of the city. The tube stations during the Blitz became the physical embodiment of the nation's ability to forge order from chaos and community from catastrophe. Though the government had initially attempted to keep the rails operating strictly for transportation, overwhelming public pressure and practical necessity transformed the network into the world's most extensive air raid shelter system. On peak nights, this subterranean refuge housed over 170,000 people. The resulting scenes would have utterly astonished the German planners, who had anticipated widespread panic. Instead, families established intricate, yet informal, territorial claims, marking their regular sleeping spots with bedding, personal items, and even small pieces of furniture. Platforms were meticulously converted into temporary living rooms where families shared dinner. Children completed their homework, and adults socialized. The organization was characteristically British. Informal, yet profoundly effective. Volunteers ensured the elderly were positioned away from drafts, while others spontaneously organized sing-alongs. Even as the bombs fell overhead, parents diligently maintained essential routines, insisting on toothbrushing and story time for their children, ensuring a vital semblance of normality prevailed below ground. This community fostered spontaneous entertainment. Musicians brought their instruments and singers performed, while some would organize games for the children. Furthermore, the ENS Entertainment National Service Association dispatched professional entertainers to shelter stations, staging shows on two platforms for audiences still clad in pajamas and dressing gowns. For children like Mary Thompson's daughters, the shelter nights, despite the horrific circumstances, became anticipated events, offering the unprecedented opportunity to play with scores of other children. Amidst the constant thrum of the subterranean world, a strange, comforting rhythm emerged. Familiarity bred resilience. The same spot, the same neighbors, the same nightly rituals, occasionally punctuated by spontaneous singing. Beatrice, for example, carefully rationed the pages of a single book, making the narrative last for weeks. Young Margaret found solace in companionship, sharing dolls and whispered stories with a nearby girl while their mothers conversed above the din. This intimacy, however, came at a steep cost. Hundreds of bodies packed into enclosed spaces with severely limited sanitation facilities meant hygiene was highly questionable, and the risk of widespread disease was a significant and ever-present threat. Yet, the profound psychological benefit of community, the sheer comfort of numbers, and the shared experience of collective endurance proved a greater palliative than the physical discomfort was a detriment. By late October, these shelters had evolved into self-sustaining micro-societies, developing a distinct underground culture. Informal leaders, recognized for their calm temperament and capability, naturally emerged to mediate disputes, organize essential activities, and maintain morale. A new social hierarchy established itself, defined not by pre-war class distinctions, but by the capacity for leadership and order. This was British civilization persisting, maintaining the social structures and behavioral norms that fundamentally defined their identity. Though driven beneath the earth by the bombing, they refused to abandon civility, humor, or the routines that imparted structure to their lives. This steadfastness represented the breaking point that Hitler's regime desperately anticipated, but which never materialized. German military strategy, executed by the Luftwaffe, rested on the flawed premise that a critical level of destruction and casualties would inevitably shatter British morale. The Luftwaffe escalated the campaign accordingly. Heavier raids, increased use of incendiaries, and the systematic targeting of densely populated working-class residential areas, aiming for maximum casualties and intense political pressure. The underlying strategic theory remained constant. Widespread suffering would generate irresistible public pressure, forcing the government toward negotiation rather than the continued sacrifice of civilian lives. November 14th, 1940, brought one of the war's most devastating raids, directed not against the capital, but against a vital industrial center of Coventry. That night, over 500 German bombers unleashed hundreds of tons of high explosive and incendiary ordnance upon the unsuspecting city. The resulting firestorm violently consumed the ancient medieval city center and tragically claimed the lives of more than 500 civilians. German propaganda, in a chilling display of calculated psychological warfare, claimed to have coined a new term, Coventrian or Coventran, meaning to obliterate a city entirely through concentrated aerial bombardment. The primary strategic objective of the raid on Coventry was clear: to offer a terrifying demonstration of the fate awaiting London if Britain refused to surrender. If a medium-sized city could be effectively destroyed in a single night, the capital city, it was assumed, would quickly yield under similar pressure. But the British response proved characteristic of their national resolve. Amidst the immediate shock, overwhelming grief, and righteous anger came unwavering resistance. Coventry's vital industrial production resumed within a matter of weeks. The populace neither fled nor demanded capitulation. Instead, they mourned their dead, cleared the mountainous rubble, and carried on. This raid, intended to shatter the British will, had instead tempered it into steel, proving definitively that no level of bombing would compel surrender. Simultaneously, the German pilots were nearing a breaking point driven not by failing morale, but by mounting casualties. Britain's air defenses were rapidly improving. Night fighters were deployed with greater efficacy, and anti-aircraft fire became both more concentrated and more accurate. Losses were escalating to levels that rendered the campaign strategically unsustainable. While Britain endured the attrition of infrastructure and civilian life, Germany was expending irreplaceable resources, experienced air crews and aircraft, on a campaign that consistently failed to achieve its objectives. The strategic calculus irrevocably favored Britain. They were defending their homeland and maintaining their military capability, while Germany was draining resources desperately needed for the impending invasion of the Soviet Union. Thus, by May 1941, the relentless Blitz campaign was concluding, not because Britain had finally broken, but because the demands of the Eastern Front required the redeployment of the Luftwaffe's might. As the strategic focus of the Third Reich shifted, significant assets of the German Luftwaffe were being redeployed eastward in preparation for the invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa. The culminating and final major raid of the Blitz descended upon London on the night of May 10, 1941. In what proved to be one of the war's heaviest single attacks, over 500 German bombers saturated the capital. The resulting devastation was catastrophic, even by the grim standards established during the previous 8 months. Over 1,400 people were killed and 1,800 seriously wounded. Iconic structures were reduced to ruin. The historic chamber of the House of Commons was destroyed, the British Museum suffered significant damage, and numerous historic churches were reduced to hollow, smoking shells. When Londoners emerged the following morning, they surveyed entire districts that had been devastated. Yet, the essential public response remained unchanged. Despite the staggering casualties, citizens immediately began clearing rubble, fighting the fires, tending to the wounded, and carrying on a profound demonstration of unwavering national resolve. Germany had applied sustained aerial bombardment at an intensity unprecedented in warfare, killing over 20,000 civilians in London alone, wounding more than 25,000, and destroying over 1 million homes. By every rational strategic measure, they had inflicted devastating physical damage. However, they had failed to break the British will or generate political pressure for surrender. The psychological victory was complete and absolute for the defense. Britain remained defiant, functional, and increasingly confident that it would outlast whatever Germany could deliver. The statistics of endurance told a definitive story. 57 consecutive nights of bombing, approximately 20,000 Londoners killed, over 1 million homes destroyed or damaged, morale unbroken, war production maintained, government function uninterrupted, population flight minimal, and political pressure for surrender non-existent. These numbers documented a critical historical finding. Aerial bombardment, no matter how sustained or intensive, could not compel a modern democracy to capitulate if its population and government maintained the absolute will to resist. The relentless aerial assault of the Blitz had delivered its final, desperate blow, failing utterly to shatter the collective will of the British people. On the morning of May 11th, following the last major Blitz raid, a night widely regarded as the most devastating London had yet endured, the city awoke to an apocalyptic sunrise. Fires still raged across the metropolis, their acrid smoke transforming the dawn into a sickly, ominous orange. Mary Thompson, clutching her 2 daughters, emerged from the subterranean safety of Stepney Green Station. Carrying the few possessions they had saved, they navigated the cratered streets toward their neighborhood. Their street had suffered a direct hit. Their house, already weakened by prior attacks, was now reduced to a mound of pulverized plaster and brick. Everything not carried into the shelter was irrevocably lost. Exhausted, frightened, and now officially homeless, Mary stood before the wreckage of her life. It was then she observed her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, standing amid the ruins of her own dwelling, triumphantly holding aloft a slightly dented teapot. "I've managed to salvage the kettle," Mrs. Patterson called out. "Shall we have a cup of tea?" Mary's immediate response was a burst of laughter, a profound, almost hysterical acknowledgement of the sheer, indomitable British absurdity. Their city was burning, their homes annihilated, yet the ritual of tea remained paramount. "Absolutely lovely," Mary replied. Amidst the chaos, as fire brigade hoses snaked through the rubble, air raid wardens checked condemned structures, and rescue workers scoured the wreckage for survivors, the 2 women sat on fragments of their front stoops, sharing chipped cups of tea. This quiet, defiant act of domestic normalcy, performed while children played in the debris and ambulances collected the casualties, encapsulated precisely the spirit of civilization that the German campaign of destruction had so fundamentally failed to comprehend or extinguish. The resilience demonstrated was not manufactured. It was intrinsic. The British populace maintained morale not through the artificial boost of state propaganda or mandated cheerfulness, but through an inherent national character, a fusion of practicality, stoicism, and a stubborn refusal to be impressed by overwhelming drama. This determination manifested as an insistence on maintaining established standards, regardless of how absurd those routines seemed against the backdrop of catastrophe. The Luftwaffe could reduce neighborhoods to rubble, They could kill neighbors indiscriminately. They could turn the great capital into a nocturnal inferno. Yet, they could not compel the populace to abandon the ritual of afternoon tea, nor could they extinguish the essential, self-deprecating humor. They could not force the British to act as if they had been defeated when the decision had been made to simply carry on. The cessation of the Blitz occurred, not because Britain had fractured under pressure, but because Germany ultimately abandoned its effort to break them. Those 57 consecutive nights of bombardment achieved a profound historical irony. They proved conclusively that British resolve was fundamentally stronger than German high explosives. This quiet determination, expressed through a million small acts of ordinary citizens maintaining extraordinary calm under impossible circumstances, secured a victory more complete than any purely military triumph could have provided. Britain demonstrated to a watching world that a free people, choosing collective resistance, could endure and outlast tyranny's worst efforts designed to enforce submission. Though the bombs had fallen, London had burned, and thousands had tragically perished, Britain never surrendered. Surrender was simply a conceptual impossibility, excluded by the very nature of the British character. That resolute refusal to acknowledge defeat, that determinately British insistence on the continuation of tea, humor, and quiet courage, ultimately proved more resilient than the entire arsenal the Luftwaffe could deliver. The global conflict would grind on for 4 more years, but the Blitz had already provided the essential answer to the pivotal question. Could Britain be bombed into submission? The verdict, written indelibly in the fire, the blood, the rubble, and the stubborn British refusal to panic, was absolutely no.